Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to give a round of an applause to the one and only Tando Hapo.
Dumelang Sanbanani greetings. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. So, in the 1940s, two American doctors ran an experiment known as the doll test. So the scientists wanted to understand the impact of racial segregation and discrimination on African American children. The test was quite simple. Children would be called in and shown two dolls that looked exactly the same, with only one difference: the doll color. So I received footage showing versions of this experiment, and I watched as children who were as young as 5 years old identify the dolls according to their racial perception. Now, one doll was identified as the black doll, and the other doll was identified as the white doll. So questions were directed to the children to reveal which qualities they thought each doll to have. Now, the questions went something like this: which doll is pretty? Which doll is ugly? Which doll is good? Which doll is mean? Now, the video displays children, despite their race, assign negative attributes toward the black doll and positive attributes toward the white doll. And the questions went along this vein until the question was asked that brought us back to the impact of the study, and that is, which doll looks more like you? Now, I paused when this happened because two observations ran through my mind. The first one was watching the heartbreaking expressions on the faces of African American children as they painfully reached for the doll that looked most like them. It was the doll that they and most other children had assigned negative attributes toward. It was the doll that I identified with as a black woman. Now, the second observation it arose instinctively, and that was that there were no African American children with albinism among the children who were being interviewed. So I started thinking about how I would have responded if I was one of those children. Now, I identified with the black doll, yes. But that is mainly because it embodied my experience. But I was also quite aware that the white doll resembled my appearance as a person with albinism on the basis of color. So for those of you who don't know, albinism manifests in all races. It is a lack of pigmentation in the skin, hair, and eyes. And this means that for people of color with albinism, we usually have bodies that contradict the dominant understanding of our race. Now, this experiment made me introspect on the two cultural and historical forms of racial discrimination that merged into my one body: my blackness in terms of race and my albinism in terms of color. So African American children would be born within the intersection of race and albinism, placing them in a world between worlds. Now, when I was born, my grandfather named me Umntana Wothando, which means a child of love. He was well aware that I was born into a body that spoke for itself before I could speak for it. Now, growing up, I grew up in a community that was filled with diverse people of color, and I remember that when I was about 6 years old, I viewed my first day of school as an exciting and scary adventure. I was so full of anticipation that my parents couldn't contain the energy that was bursting out of my little body. And I think that gender was the only social stratification at this point that I knew. Race and albinism were not as yet learned concepts for me. However, like most children who are different in one way or another, school became an initiation ground. In that I was the only person in my school who did not have brown skin. And not only that, the lack of pigmentation that ran through my body, including my eyes, resulted in me being short-sighted. So I struggled to make out words and numbers on the chalkboard as well as on my school books. Now, the set of circumstances that my body found itself in was met with some antagonism from some of my peers as well as some adults. And I grew to understand that there was a whole institution that was culturally created about my existence. From derogatory names in almost all sub-Saharan African languages to a formalized English term, which some of you might know, the term is albino. Now, according to the Oxford Dictionary, albino means a person or animal with a congenital absence of pigment in the skin and hair, which are white, and eyes, which are usually pink. Now, apart from other issues with that definition, I need to mention that as a Black person, I have in my racial history a sore spot that is reignited whenever my existence is described on the same wavelength as you would an animal. So albinism is no different for me. So for clarity, my preferred terminology is person with albinism, not albino. But the plot does thicken for albinism, in that in certain contexts it's been subjected to superstitious beliefs, to negative scientific interpretations that described it and labeled it as a genetic disorder or a congenital disease, to cinematic misrepresentations that portrayed it as a freak of nature or as evil, to almost no representation in the beauty economy at the time. So as a young woman, I was living in a culture that was built up to dismiss, marginalize, and discriminate against my kind of human experience. Albinism was culturally created to being an institutionalized other. Now, all this socially constructed madness taught me that we as a society struggle to see difference as part of human diversity, be it race, gender, sexuality, or be it albinism. The patterns of othering were undeniably similar. But my life went on with a semblance of functionality, and I went through many lived chapters in my life. And I landed on one strange but enlightening chapter, which I locate in my adult life. So the year was 2012, and I met designer Gert Johan Coetzee, who's a fashion designer. I was a full-time prosecutor at the time, and he asked me to do a fashion shoot for his campaign. Now, I was reluctant, to say the least. And I remember I had this conversation with my sister, and I told her about the ridiculous prospect of me being a model while being a lawyer. And she said in turn, she said, I don't understand why you think this is such a ridiculous idea. Do you know how many perceptions you could change using this platform? Now, I was unaware at the time that she was actually giving me a mission statement for the work that I was about to do. So anyway, I reached out to Gert, and during our meeting, I gave him the most matter-of-fact legal voice that was loaded with years of institutional baggage. I said, Gert, I will do this modeling thing, provided that we represent albinism in a positive way. Now, I was about to embark on a journey that would show me what an oversimplification that statement actually was. So I completed my project with Gert, and I actually had fun doing the shoot. But the interest that the project generated from different industry players would help me quickly understand that this was not going to be an easy journey. So I'm going to take you to a year later, 2013. I have this amazing shoot with Forbes Life magazine. And this shoot actually documented a decision that would be a hallmark decision in my career. And that was to present my eyebrows and eyelashes as pale, believe it or not. Now, I had always altered my appearance by just darkening my eyebrows and eyelashes, and this was just how I presented my beauty to the world and to my nuclear community. But note, the image of Black albinism was usually not celebrated in our global beauty culture. And not only that, in our South African popular culture, I had not seen the image being associated with beauty. So this particular decision was accompanied with a lot of self-doubt. So the shoot ended, But my decision continued. And I was met with some resistance from industry corridors when I pursued my new appearance. So the behind-the-scenes advice went something like this. Oh, but you have to put on mascara on your lashes and darken your brows, or else your face is going to disappear, sweetie. Or, how, I thought you said you were done with your makeup. Did you forget your eyebrows? Now, the odd thing was, I was just trying to look like myself. I was trying to embrace the unique characteristics that 500,000 people across the world are born with. I wanted to be the kind of woman that the younger me looked for in magazines but just never found. Now, with the upcoming new world of diversity, old ideas still persevered in the dominant culture, and I started feeling like I was unnecessarily choosing a harder route. But interestingly, albinism was not the only representation that affected me, because race, gender, and nation would also remind me of their representational harm in media. Black people, women, and Africans are still warding off the impact of harmful representation in media that they didn't even have equal control over. And the representation expressed itself in our popular culture through negative stereotypes, exploitative representation, objectification, and misrepresentation that communicated social inferiority. So my albinism, my blackness, my womanhood, and my Africanness would make the question of who I represent quite a politically loaded affair. My body attracted scenarios that reminded me consistently that I carry more than just one identity. My in front of the camera image was usually accomplished after maneuvering microaggressions and stereotypes, not just about albinism, but about race, gender, and nation too. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Race. So we would love to sign you, but you would look more accessible with like a long brown weave. Or, could we make her lips smaller? Or, I'm sorry, I just can't work with hair like this. Now, the nuanced attacks that I received were not just limited to race, because being a woman came with its own set of challenges. Gender. Hi, so I know that I'm asking you to do this pretty late on set, but could you just put on this shirt? It'll show a little bit of your nipples, but it'll be tastefully done. Or, relax. He's just asking you to put on boob pasties. I mean, you're gonna seriously have to stop being so conservative. Now, to be clear, female sexuality and sensuality are to be celebrated, but from a place of bodily agency and bodily sovereignty, not from a place of expectation or obligation. Next, Africa. Could you tell us about the albino killings in Africa? What are some of the superstitions Africans have about albinos? Or, do you consider yourselves warriors for your cause? Or, could you let us know about the most frightening experience in your country? Now, I would read about Africa as if it is one big country, not a continent with complexity and variation. I was consistently asked the same questions to confirm the same narrative indiscriminately without much context given. And I realized that the much needed albinism awareness was being invaded by an enduring stereotype about what Africa is singularly understood to be: a place of fear, violence, struggle, and witchcraft, overlooking balancing narratives about family, community, progress, and culture. I felt as though the environment was closing in on me, in that it was not ready to receive or adapt to difference, not in content or in form. I felt like there were just too many stereotypes to juggle, too much prejudices to counter, too much racial and gendered history that was playing out in my everyday activities in my career. Now, as a Black African woman with albinism, my very existence attracts social and political consequences, and all of it is significant for me. It is my world between worlds. In the same way I could not just pick one doll, I cannot just pick one identity. An inclusive culture accepts that it is not this or that. It is this and that. The combination of our many worlds is a cultural resource, and if I've learned anything from my various experiences, it is that we are a product of culture. We are a result of all the narratives and the cultural constructs that are projected onto our bodies. However, we can reshape these narratives and become producers of culture. Now, I've learned to use my multiplicity as a cultural asset, in that I choose projects that give me various access points to humanity through my multiple identities. And I find that projects that allow for consultation, shared control over representation, co-creation, authenticity, and allow for an embracing of multifacetedness, these projects leave an undeniable cultural footprint. But most importantly, they bring us closer to inclusive narratives and cultural reform. Now, the next projects that I'm going to share with you are my collaborations, which are kind of like my favorite anecdotes. Now, the first one is the Audi and Taggable campaign, which partnered with Ogilvy. And the campaign was about challenging stereotypes and singular identity myths. Now, that was the award-winning Untaggable campaign. And the next one was the Pirelli calendar, an all-cast calendar that really spoke about race and representation, but also it was the historical adaptation of Alice in Wonderland. And the next one was the Foschini campaign. This campaign spoke about women's solidarity as well as affirmations, and it was called the I Am All Woman campaign. And the last one I'd like to share with you is Vogue, which not only made history in terms of albinism and representation, but also celebrated the beauty of African fashion and luxury. Now, looking back at the doll test, the gap that I inhabited within the test reminded me that there's always a world between worlds, and that an unseen existence does not amount to an absent existence. And the reminder manifested in a trying but informative media journey that asserted that an absence of representation does not translate to an absence of life, of talent, of perspective, of complexity, and of value. Now, if we responsibly access one another's humanity by redesigning cultural environments and narratives to being more inclusive, then the better our chances are in building an expansive cultural economy, but also building a future that dares to be large enough to see all of us participate in it. Thank you.
She make me want to cry. This is not the first time I've seen this, and she's so articulate about it that it's very hard for me to ask any question. I just want to tell you that I admire your courage and this journey that we are embarking on, you are embarking on. I'll be on your side. You gotta be courageous. She told me she received death threat. So when you go back home, what are you gonna do? Tell me.
When I go back home, what am I going to do? I think I'm going to do what I've done before I came here and what I'll do even after here. I'll continue to try and be. And I don't like the term, when they say a voice for the voiceless, because I read somewhere that there's no such thing as the voiceless, there's just the deliberately unheard or deliberately ignored. But what I can only do is just do my best to contribute to my efforts toward human rights and inclusion. So I think that's what I'm just going to try and do.
Do you think that in South Africa it will be possible to create an alliance between discriminated people in South Africa to get this message across the whole country?
I think so. I think you are beginning to see, people are beginning to see patterns and trends when it comes to difference and othering. And I think, whether you are in the LGBTQI community, whether you're dealing with disability rights activism, and I don't like the word disability, I prefer otherly abled, but you tend to find that there is a lot of solidarity when it comes to movements. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know that with respect to me, I learned so much from feminist struggle, critical race theory, disability rights activism, and advocacy. And I think the thing about it is that we understand that oppression is connected, all oppression is connected, mm-hmm. and it plays out the same way. So I do think that it creates a foundation for solidarity.
Okay. Can we get some questions from you guys? Come on, don't be shy. Everybody's stunned. It's too beautiful, you can't talk? Come on, don't hide behind the beauty. Right here.
As a disabled woman working in the entertainment industry, I have faced a lot of very overt discrimination in the industry. And I'm so happy you shared some of the really positive experiences and campaigns you worked on. Have you also faced a lot of kind of the other side of that coin, kind of that overt discrimination against you and kind of basically being told you don't belong or deserve to be in the industry?
I have. And the reason why I made this presentation this way, for some people they might consider it light. Yeah. It's because I wanted to focus on the nuance. So when somebody says, you are the other, so whether they call you names or whatever the case may be, I mean, I've had people say, oh, well, we're not going to have her in our magazine. She doesn't represent the demographic. And you're thinking, but I'm a black woman in a society that, majority is black, and then what do you mean I don't represent the demographic, And I think I received all of these issues in a more nuanced way. And there are times when you feel like an injury has been done and you don't have the words for it, you don't have the language. You just know that you had an interaction with somebody and you leave wounded, And I think what I was trying to do here is to show the nuance and how it can be an accumulative effect. So to be quite honest, yeah, I experience it probably more often than I would ever want to. But I think it's sort of certain things that you have to go through to build emotional resilience. So I don't know if I've answered your question.
Sorry, there's a question back here.
Yes.
I mean, that was exceptional.
Thank you.
My older brother has insisted that I stand up. I mean, that was amazing. And thank you for the privilege of allowing us to be part of the journey. And so my question is twofold. One, what would you ask of us as individuals who took the time to be here, to take this forward? And some of us have the privilege to represent organizations that can meaningfully make a difference, what would you ask of those organizations?
To be deliberate about diversity and inclusion. A great deal of the times, and I show Vogue here, but the first time I was on a Condé Nast cover was actually Glamour magazine. And the editor was Asanda Sizani, and I remember every choice that she made was deliberate. She would ask in terms of how she chose the people who were going to represent the cover of Glamour when it was brand new Glamour and was about to go out into the public. She made deliberate choices when she decided to speak about female solidarity, and she chose women who were from different backgrounds to basically symbolize that solidarity. But then she also brought it into an institution, so it wasn't just symbolic. She institutionalized her decision and her deliberateness. So all I can really just say is be deliberate about inclusivity and diversity. Ask yourself, if there is a woman who is otherly abled and let's say she is a brown woman, which stories do we want her to be a part of? How can we expand society's imagination? How can we expand even her aspirations? And then you put her in those stories. You allow those stories and those narratives to actually live and be archived in our society. You show the story of her being a CEO. You show the story of her being a mother. But you also show the story of the difficulty, because that's the thing. As I said, an inclusive culture is not this or that. It is this and that. It is the complexity of humanity. So you need to be more deliberate in the choices.
Anand?
Thando, thanks for all you have done, and for women and for the people of the world, not only Africa.
Thank you.
I think when you look at our constitution in South Africa, it's very clear, and when you look at Madiba and his view in those days with people with albinism, taking pictures, making sure that the national platform of our country's people are represented. You've taken that to a level that he would be very proud of. So continue to do what you do. And my question is, globally, how has your work brought people to you from all over the world to speak out even further? Thank you. And anything I can do to help, feel free to call.
I think one thing that this journey has taught me is to not individualize the progress that's happened with respect to albinism. When I started, there was hardly any representation when it came to albinism, but there wasn't no representation. Because, I was standing on basically the stories of Salif Keita, of Konichu. And as time went on, when I started, I also had other models who were being represented, but it's just that it was difficult to get our voices through. But then at the same time, the UN came in and brought in the independent expert with matters surrounding albinism. So what I started understanding is institutions need to work together at the same time. So I was building bargaining power using the media. But it's not enough to just only work on one side. You need all the institutional pillars to be working together. You need to also be having the conversations about inclusive education while you're showing all these models who are doing amazing things. You need to also be looking at legal reform and trying to see how the law can be more responsive to issues of albinism. It's the same thing, same pattern with LGBTQI rights, same pattern with almost anything. You have to have institutional pillars working together. And what I've noticed just in terms of my media journey is I always also work with institutional pillars. And I worked with the UN to, for policy discussions around albinism. I'm going there right now after this to do exactly that. So I think that's the thing, is that you just need to know that you're interconnected as institutions. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Thando. This was incredible. And so I sit here with goosebumps just listening to you. I have 3 daughters myself and lead an education technology nonprofit that works primarily in Africa and countries like Nigeria and Kenya specifically. And we see issues and the issue of diversity and inclusion with girls in technology. And our mantra is really, you can't be what you can't see, right? So my question to you, Thando, is how much have you been able to do, or how much are you doing out there in communities where this is still, the concept of albinism is still a problem? And how much are you doing to ensure that these young girls growing up in these countries are confident and have the right opportunity to speak and be an advocate for the issue?
Okay, so there's a very interesting campaign that's happening right now in South Africa, and I'm hoping that this campaign will be able to grow. And the campaign is called the Can Be campaign, because it really falls into you can't be what you can't see. And the campaign was actually started by Mpho Jobe, who is in a foundation called Albinism Advocacy. And what I really just try to do in terms of almost all albinism organizations is I'm really affiliated to all of them. But the reason why the Can Be campaign means most to me is because it allows us to go into schools and mentor. And not only that, kids can have a diversification of mentorship. So they get to see a woman with albinism who's a lawyer and media, a person with albinism who's in engineering, etc. But then after that also have mechanisms that allow them to be connected to bursaries. But this is almost at a micro scale. And hopefully is going to grow into a macro scale. So I really think that that campaign could do with a lot of support. So yeah, I think that's really what in terms of what it is that I've done. But also is that more than anything, I think, working with the United Nations has been the most interesting thing for me, because what the action plan was in the United Nations in 2016 that we consulted on, we constantly went through the implementation level up until last year when it was actually being implemented. And it looked at really many phases, including education, including laws, including best practices in other African countries and things that worked. So I'm just hoping that even, the institutional synergy will be able to make a difference.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I have two, but I don't think the room will mind that I have two. No, because of the first one. The first one is,
Yeah.
why are you so awesome? And I want you to take that seriously. And then the second one is, having gotten to know you just a small amount in the last couple of days, it's very clear that you carry with you a strength of being larger than the spaces that you enter. Right? When they're looking at you and trying to reduce you to a look or a two-dimensional space, then you have your intellect and your skills and your training. I want to just basically grow on Njideke's question. How much is that a part of what you're trying to give to generations that are looking and seeing a possible self in you? Is a person and a self that's larger than the rooms they're walking into as you're leading with example?
I'm not sure I understand the question, though. Can I ask you to please put it in more layman's terms?
You can, and now I won't have a mic to do it. But that's
It's fine.
Hearing you talk, I was eavesdropping on you giving an interview yesterday.
Yes.
And you were talking about walking into a room where fashion is what's being rewarded. But you are also always awarded. You are also always a thinker. You are also always an activist. You are more than just the one thing that they're trying to reduce you to. And I wonder if giving those multiple selves, you said this and that, giving those multiple selves to the people coming after you, how intentional is that, and in what ways?
Very intentional. It's very, I intentionally portray myself as a person with a legal background. I intentionally portray myself as a model too. I intentionally portray myself as Black, as a woman, as a person with albinism, as African. I put those narratives intentionally out there because I believe that it is, I was actually put in a situation where when I started doing the whole modeling thing, the singular identity was so consuming and so prejudicial in how consuming it was. I was actually saying that there was a time when I didn't even have a name. It was just albino model, ABCD albino model, So I decided to actually, because it unmakes you as a human being, We already have our humanity, but we can be put in dehumanizing situations. So I decided to intentionally show a broader humanity by putting myself in broader human stories. Law is a broad human story. Modeling is a broad human story. Albinism is a broad human story. Africa is a broad human story. But then we actually see the complexity and the completion of the human being. So yeah.